the greatest leaders were willing to hear and sit down at a table with other leaders and seek um, common grounds and listen. I think so much of leadership has become a leadership without purpose. It's a leadership by title, but without a purpose. And I think we really need to start to go back to aspirational goals and start to find a purpose that we all can agree upon and work towards. And it takes leaders to get there.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
If we look at the end of the Cold War as taking an enemy away, because to a degree that was what we battled. If you watched all the TV shows in the 60s and 70s and you were looking and the James Bond movies, we were battling against the red threat, the communist threat. And the walls came down, Mr. Gorbachev, and we had less of an implied threat. Obviously, we still had this nuclear issue that was going on. And there was a period of time, I don't know how long it was, that, life went on. And maybe the threat was behind the scenes. Maybe it was more in the intelligence community. And then the threat revisited us in 9/11. And we now have a new threat. And the efforts of Cheney and Bush to do whatever they wanted to get the outcomes that they were seeking has, in my opinion, started a ongoing chain of events that each president is being faced with, this double standard, and you can't undo what the past president did, so you kind of have to follow through. And I think we saw this with Afghanistan recently with Biden because of Trump's commitment. And I'm sure Trump had some commitments left over from Obama, and Obama definitely had some messes to clean up from Bush. But we're now identifying, creating new challenges, new terrors that we're facing, and there doesn't seem to be any effort to quiet down. The other thing is that a lot of it has come from our efforts to try to democratize the entire world when we can't even democratize our own country.
Yeah, well, I think we've democratized our own country. We seem to be trying to pull back from that democracy, but you're right. The effort of building other nations
Right.
is folly to begin with, because we shouldn't be building any nation that doesn't want. We're trying to force our form of government on another group of people.
Absolutely.
And I don't care how benevolent an effort we may be trying, you can't do that. It doesn't make sense to build a replica of our country someplace else that does not seem to want it or defend it. But every president, starting with Adam, takes over the messes that the previous president started.
Yep.
Or completes the projects that the previous president wasn't able to finish in 4 or 8, or in Eisenhower's case, 16 years. Roosevelt, I'm sorry. But still, in the last 20 years, what we failed to do is recapture our aspirational value of the country. That no longer seems to be a valued commodity, a valued asset for us. It's the aspirational goals. Even when we had segregation, there was still the hypocritical aspirational goals that we were all things to all people, even though we had laws in regions of the country that did not live up to the aspirational goals of our Constitution. But the beauty of our democracy at the time was here's how we work things out. Now, this may be a hiccup too, but it's a very valid hiccup. But what bothers me the most is that this 25% have sainted themselves. And unfortunately, in some cases, I have demonized them. And that prevents us from rebuilding the nation. I'm beginning to wonder which discussion, which conversation is more difficult to have. The conversation about patriotism or the conversation about inclusion, diversity and inclusion. If I started a conversation with Trump, with using Trump's name, I don't think I'd get very far in some settings. I gave a presentation to some industry leaders. Honestly, I was surprised. It was just executives in the room. And I thought what they wanted was to tell me how their company had helped Western out. And I thought it was related to Western. They just wanted to talk about diversity and inclusion, race relations, and my views about the profession and where it was going and the leadership of the profession, et cetera. And it turned out to just be a conversation. After I was introduced, I was like, oh, I didn't know that's why I was here, because I wasn't prepared to. What I recognized was that they felt comfortable, some pretty tawdry issues within the profession, because I made them feel comfortable, including diversity and inclusion, right? Because as you and I have been doing for the last year and a half, it's about the conversation. That's how you rebuild a nation. You reset alignments. You realign your relationships. But you can't do that without understanding where everybody stands. Right now, we don't seem to care where everybody stands. Anyway, after that meeting was at 4:00 in the afternoon. 2:00 in the morning, I'm still talking to some of those people. And they made it known that, first of all, they said how much they enjoyed the conversation. So did I. But they made it known that the reason was this was the first time they literally felt free to just talk and to challenge themselves or others without recrimination.
Were you the only black man in the room?
Yes.
Just thought I'd ask.
Yes, I was. But anyway, at one point somebody said, why can't we do this all the time? And my response was, well, usually it's, why can't people come in with an open mind? And I said, well, that's why we can't do this all the time. Because when people approach these kind of conversations, they don't have an open mind. They come in with the goal of convincing you what they already know, and that is they are right.
And that's politics versus conversation.
I don't know what I don't even call that politics, because you get nothing done if that's politics.
Well, proselytizing then.
Yes.
You're trying to sell something. It's
well,
pitching.
Yeah. Well, what they're doing is that they've made up their mind, and now you're right, they're proselytizing, but they're not selling something other than they're trying to convince people. They have decided that this is what's wrong with whatever we're talking about.
Right.
And here's the answer. And now it's about an argument rather than an analysis, right? Because if we start out by saying, okay, wait, let's back up a minute. Let's look at your assumption that this is what's wrong. Yeah. If we can't start there, then we're never going to get to an appeasement, right? Now, if we can start there, that doesn't necessarily mean that your assumption is wrong or right, right? What I'm trying to force you to do is to consider other possibilities, and we may end up not agreeing on what is wrong. Well, if we do, then it's no surprise why we won't end up agreeing on the solution. But we can at least agree that the problem can be approached from different perspectives.
And I think that is a huge issue globally in this country right now. The willingness to consider other people's perspective and other possibilities. We are so polarized.
Yeah.
And until we can come into a conversation with a somewhat blank sheet of paper and listen first and respond, not react, but respond based upon what you've heard, we will continue to separate. And you were talking earlier about aspirational goals. I would agree. I think as a country, getting back to some aspirational goals is really where we need to go. And I would hope, and maybe President Joe will have time to do so, we can get back to those aspirational goals, because we are spending so much perspiration that we have no time for aspiration right now. The conversations that we've had for over a year are conversations that need to happen, not just on DE&I, but on other areas as well. And the willingness to accept that you could be wrong, the willingness to accept that somebody else might be right, and just the willingness to hear both sides to the debate or the discussion is something we have lost, because when you can hear both sides, you can start to consider other possibilities and you can seek other solutions. And if you enter into a conversation with as if it were a debate or a battle, it's much harder. But if you enter into a conversation as an opportunity to learn and to get information and knowledge, then you can be changed.
Yeah, what you just said, I definitely agree. I have certain nuances. We have to get away from right and wrong in our conversation. What we have to focus on is an exchange of ideas without the judgment that comes with it. Ingenuity is the result of dreaming. But if you shackle it with the need to be right, then you limit your dream. You limit the possibilities. You can always dismiss the options later, but you at least need to be able to consider the options. And I'm not saying that you throw everything on the wall and you keep everything good or bad, but you don't go into solving a problem with that in mind. You go into solving a problem with coming up with solving the problem.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. We deal with it in the veterinary profession. We deal with it in life. We deal with it in church and temple. We deal with it in politics. This coming in with I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah. Whereas the moment you do that, you're no longer focused on the problem.
Right.
Now your ego and your pride is more important than solving the problem that fits everybody, that best fits everybody involved, right? But when I have to solve the problem in order to appease my sense of value as opposed to your sense of values, set of values, then we're polarized. But if we can at least discuss it, and we seem to be in a period of reductionism now. Every problem has a simple answer. Or every problem has a simple cause. Our labor shortage is because everybody was getting a check from the federal government. Well, that ended last week. So now where's this flood of laborers? The oversimplification of our problems is and a testament to our reluctance to deal with complexity. And our reluctance to deal with complexity leads to problems never being solved.
There's an article to my right that is entitled "Why Simplicity is So Complex," because it's actually harder to make things simple than to keep things complex. And by actually trying to create these simple solutions, for lack of a better way to, or so simple causes, we're actually making them more hard, more difficult, more complex from that standpoint. So yes, it's much easier to blame something on somebody else. It's much easier to have one answer rather than a group of interdigitated events that are going to happen all at the same time. I still suggest that in many cases what we're dealing with is a perfect storm of things that all happen, but we haven't quite identified what all those storms are. And I've said it before at some point in these podcasts, and I have said it in other platforms. I think we still have a huge problem with leadership and a lack of leadership in politics, in all sorts of areas. And I think it's this, the greatest leaders were willing to hear and sit down at a table with other leaders and seek common grounds and listen. I think so much of leadership has become a leadership without purpose. It's a leadership by title, but without a purpose. And I think we really need to start to go back to aspirational goals and start to find a purpose that we all can agree upon and work towards. And it takes leaders to get there.
Well, I'm not sure I know what your population of leaders are. I don't know if you're talking about national leaders or professional leaders or
global,
or even global leaders. I find it difficult to castigate leadership like that. Although I have no problem saying that that in many cases they have failed us. I believe that there are good and bad leaders in Congress. I believe that we have had good and bad presidents. But I believe that um, uh, and to take the abstraction even further, uh, our citizens are our leaders, and we have failed ourselves in that we have uh, uh, yielded more to blaming our lead our in and now I just want to narrow my response to the national politic and say that uh, uh, we spend a lot of perspiration. I like that. I like the way you put it. Blaming our elected officials, which is exactly what um, Trump supporters have been doing under the guise of a big lie. They are, and that's the danger when we start making blanket criticisms of leaders, because that's a simple statement to make rather than saying, I did not agree with their vote on this issue. But I do agree with their vote on this one. But when we just castigate them and say we've got a problem with leadership, to me that oversimplifies the problem. But it's very easy to say that the whoever was in charge of the voting process in Georgia didn't do their job when they didn't overturn the election, when they did their job when they didn't overturn the election because they found no evidence for doing it. But now we can use a blanket accusation, and when we make that blanket accusation and get just a few people to believe it without any evidence, we end up passing a law that restricts voting as a solution to the concern that was raised by the person who lost the election. And so those kind of insidious, non-fact-based reactions, which is total bullshit, but that's what's written in the law. If you read that law, the preamble to that law actually says that they were responding to concerns raised by the electorate over the 2020 election. And yet, none of those concerns were validated. It was just a perpetual haranguing by the former president that resulted in a few people saying, yeah, you're right. And now all of a sudden that becomes the basis for the need of a law. But as a citizen, how do I handle that? That's where leadership comes in. And the way I handle that is I should hold my leaders accountable.
Absolutely. And if you look at some of the discussions already where the election coming up on Tuesday is already being accused of being invalid before we even get to Tuesday, and every election going forward will be considered to be invalid.
Because it works. All you have to do is raise a complaint. You don't have to have any facts.
Right. My point being is that if leaders want to take that tact to get themselves into positions of leadership, that's where I think leadership is broken.
Well, but that's some leaders.
Right. But
that's not all leaders.
I know, but the ones that have gotten the most attention are not the quiet leaders, unfortunately. The quiet leaders go about their business and get things done.
And there's some vocal leaders on the other side too. And that's why I'm saying that simplistic castigation of leadership can't be made, because even that's complex.
I know, but it makes it easy for me to just pick something to target right now.
Again, being simple makes it complex, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.